So I'm going to show you my ground beef basics. This is my base recipe for ground beef products. So I am not the biggest fan of ground beef. I think the flavor is a little bland and the texture is often dense or mealy. I don't really care for burgers. I hated meatloaf as a kid. I I had a couple of chefs teach me some tricks though that totally changed my perspective on ground beef and made it something that I actually enjoy. So the first thing is texture. I don't care for the density that ground beef cooks up to, particularly like if you have a real well done burger and a big, thick, well done burger. So the Wellington burger at Smithtown Seafood from local chef hero Weta Michaels. Weta is a really big leader in the Lexington area, and she does all kinds of things at some really amazing restaurants. So the Wellington burger, when I had it, it was both more healthful and sustainable because it uses a lot less ground beef to make the burger. So you would essentially consume less meat, which would take less cows to raise and less resources off of the environment. So the big difference between this burger is the addition of the mushrooms. Mushrooms, yep. Mushrooms are sponges. They soak up and absorb all the fun things: flavor, juice, moisture. They loosen the ground beef up so that it's not dense anymore. So I mise en place my equipment. I get my cutting station set up, and I use my food processor. You can do all of this with a knife, but the food processor is just quick and easy, and it does it faster and more thorough. So I get my cutting station set up, I get my ingredients out, and I mise en place everything. I use the blade attachment in the bottom of the food processor. For ingredients, all of the ingredients serve a purpose. So they add flavor, they add moisture, they loosen that ground beef. The first thing I'm adding is peppers. So I love poblano peppers. They're one of my favorites. They are mildly spicy. You could utilize jalapenos or more spicy pepper if you wanted to. You can also do sweet bell peppers or green peppers, but the red, yellow, orange, or green bell peppers have a lot more moisture and kind of water in them. Um, and for mushrooms, any type of mushroom works, but the portobello is my favorite. And for onions, you could, I think, use a red variety, but you're going to cook. Usually, red variety you would use in something that isn't cooked. I always get the sweet onions. So, sweet onions have a much thinner outer layer and they often look squished up. So, if you look at like this onion right here that I'm circling, it looks kind of like somebody stepped on it. That is an indicator of a sweet onion. The really round onions that have a lot of papery skin, those are storage onions, and a lot sometimes in the deep winter that's all that's available. But they make you cry a lot more. They have a lot more of that sulfuric component that really makes your eyes water. So I want to mince these up. I top and tail them. I remove all the parts I don't want. I wash and throw them into the food processor. Don't overfill the processor. And also, the mushrooms do better if you do them separately. So I'll probably do like the onions and peppers together, put them into the bowl, and then put the mushrooms in, and then put them into the bowl. So pulsing, mincing, pureeing, and chopping. When you use a food processor, the food processor can rough chop, it can fine mince, and it can puree. It's going to work really fast. That blade is really sharp and spins really fast. For this recipe, a fine mince is good. If you overdid it, then that would still work okay. But I don't want to liquefy or baby food my items. I just want small pieces. So to get that, you actually want to pulse the food processor, not just turn it on. So let me play that clip and show you what that's like. So pulsing, it runs that motor for a short little burst instead of just turning it on. And that's if you want to control how much it's chopping your vegetables, then that pulse feature is the way to go. Instead of just turning it on. So if you turn it on, it's just going to come on and stay on and puree everything. We don't want that again. Okay. So now I add all my minced ingredients, and this is a picture of the mushrooms. You can see they're super, super small. And so I used, for my ratio recipe for this, I used one full onion, one small package of mushrooms, and two poblano peppers or one bell pepper. And then I add my ground meat product. So I added like a pound of ground beef, and then I think this package is about a pound of chorizo. So it's about a 1-to-1 ratio. You could do all ground beef, you could do all chorizo, but I like to mix the two together. Chorizo is it's a pork product, so if you don't eat pork, then you would not want to do the chorizo, but you could add spices and just do all ground beef. So you could do 2 pounds of ground beef instead of mixing the two together, but I like the flavor of the two mixed together and the texture. So since I'm using chorizo, I already have spices in there. So chorizo has chili powder, cumin powder, paprika. Um, I'm just going to add a good heaping spoonful of minced garlic, some salt, and some pepper to my recipe. If I didn't use chorizo, then I might choose to add those spices in, depending on what I'm doing. If I wanted to make meatballs, I could do the same recipe, and instead of putting spices, I would use herbs like Italian herbs and seasoning. I always would put the garlic in and the salt and pepper. So I use my hands to mix it well. Don't overwork it, just blend it together. And this is my base. So if I was going to create burgers, this is where I would stop, and I would just make burgers out of this. If I was going to make meatloaf, then I would add a little bit of sauce, some ketchup, some barbecue, whatever you like as far as sauce goes, just not too much because there's already a lot of moisture in there. And then 1 to 2 eggs and 1.5 cup of oats. Quick or rolled oats work. That's right, oats. Oats in your meatloaf are way better than crackers or breadcrumbs. They cook up less densely and they're a lot more nutritious. I will say, if you are making meatloaf for the purpose of making meatloaf sandwiches leftovers, then you may want to go with the crackers or the breadcrumbs. But the oats are they're just better and they're healthier. You can also do this recipe, particularly with the mushrooms, and do a meatloaf and do it almost kind of, and it make it a little more keto style and kind of leave the grain product out. Oh, and you would add some eggs to help bind it together, but you would want to maybe leave the grains out if you were going to do keto style. Oats do have less carbohydrates than some grains, and so you could just add a very small amount of the oats, and that might work okay. So you can make a big batch of this and portion and freeze it. You can patty it up into burgers and freeze them. Burgers actually grill better if they're still about half frozen. So if I'm making burgers, I mise en place my station. I patty them out and put them in between wax paper and Ziploc bags. So I don't want to cross contaminate once I have this stuff on my hands. So I set my station up before I start pattying the burgers. So I put one cutting board out and I line it with wax paper. And then I get a ball, bigger than a golf ball, smaller than a tennis ball, and I roll it in my hand, and it kind of tightens it. And then I patty it out a little bit and put it onto the cutting board. And then I space them out. This cutting board I usually just put 4. I keep them spaced out because I'm gonna kind of squish them down a little bit. Put a layer of wax paper in between each one, and then put a layer of wax paper on the top. And you can use a second cutting board and kind of flatten them out just a little bit, and it makes them kind of nice together. When you flatten them out, you can also work your hands in there and make sure you keep the edges together so your edges don't break off. And then I just make sure that they are separated with wax paper. I kind of fold it in half and I slide it into a Ziploc baggie, and I lay it out flat in the freezer or the deep freeze. For me, when I make meatloaf, I like to use a pan that came out of a toaster oven, flipped upside down, and that allows the oil and the grease to cook down. So I have a piece of parchment paper underneath so it doesn't all just like cook onto my baking sheet pan. And I don't like to make it too thick because it'll take too long to cook. So I make it kind of football shaped and about 2 inches thick. This is a meatloaf that's the size for 2 people, 2 or 3 people, depending on your size. I don't like to put the ketchup on until I've cooked it at least about 75%. So I cook it for about 40 minutes at 350. and then I put my ketchup layer on and I smooth it out with a fork, and then I cook it for about another 10 to 15 minutes. You want to make sure the inside's about 165 and all the juices and stuff are good and cooked. And so that's my ground beef or meatloaf. You could definitely vary that up a little bit and make some meatballs or do other things with it. But those are the two products with my base that I make the most, burgers and meatloaf out of that.